Hey friend, before we dive in, if you love stories that bring the Bible to life in a real, visual, and powerful way, take 2 seconds, hit like, and subscribe, and let's spread this message together. Introduction. Imagine being so despised that your neighbors sneer at your every move. That was Zacchaeus, a man known throughout Jericho as the chief tax collector. He had wealth and authority, collecting taxes for the Romans, but his own people saw him as a traitor. Every coin he earned seemed to build a wall between him and his community. Yet, for all his riches, Zacchaeus was missing something deeper. One day he made a choice that would change his life forever. What did Jesus say that transformed this sinner into a man of grace? Let's step into Jericho and see what made Zacchaeus' story so remarkable. The city and the scorned man. Jericho in the 1st century was a city with a constant flow of people and business. Its location on a major trade route made it a center for goods and travelers moving between Jerusalem and the lands east of the Jordan. But more than its busy markets or its strategic placement, Jericho was known as a place where taxes were collected for Rome. The Roman Empire relied on cities like Jericho to keep their system running, and that meant someone had to be in charge of collecting the money. In Jericho, that someone was Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus was not just any tax collector, he was the chief tax collector, as the Gospel of Luke points out. This meant he oversaw other tax agents and managed the collection of taxes from his own people, the Jews, to be sent to the occupying Roman government. His job put him at the center of a system everyone resented. The people of Jericho didn't just dislike paying taxes, they hated the idea of one of their own working for the enemy. Every coin handed over felt like a small defeat, a reminder that they were not free. The Roman tax system made things even worse. Tax collectors weren't paid a salary. Instead, they were expected to collect extra money from the people, whatever they could get away with, and keep the surplus for themselves. This system, known as tax farming, was open to abuse. It was legal, but it was deeply unfair. Tax collectors often became wealthy by taking more than what was required, and the community knew it. Zacchaeus, as chief tax collector, would have been seen as someone who not only participated in this system, but led it. His wealth was a sign of how much he had taken from others. For Zacchaeus, this role brought him a kind of power and privilege, but it came at a steep price. His neighbors saw him as a traitor, someone who had turned against his own people for personal gain. The resentment ran deep. He was not just disliked, he was actively shunned. People avoided him in the streets. Conversation stopped when he walked by. Even though he lived in the middle of Jericho, Zacchaeus was isolated. He was surrounded by people, but truly alone. It's important to remember that Zacchaeus' isolation was not just about his job. The people who looked at him with suspicion and anger were the same people he had grown up with. These were his childhood friends, his extended family, the people he might have worshipped with as a boy. Over time, as he became more successful and his wealth grew, the distance between Zacchaeus and his community widened. He became a symbol of everything people hated about the Roman occupation. In rabbinical writings, tax collectors were sometimes compared to robbers. That's how deep the sense of betrayal went. Despite his wealth, Zacchaeus' life was marked by a sense of emptiness. He had more than enough money, but he had lost the respect of his community. He was called a sinner, a cheat, and an outsider. The label stuck, and it shaped how people treated him, and maybe even how he saw himself. There's a kind of loneliness that comes from being cut off from those who should know you best. Zacchaeus lived with that every day. Still, something about Zacchaeus' story makes us pause. If he believed that money was all he needed, why did he feel restless? Why did he care about someone like Jesus coming to town? The answer lies in the human need for something deeper than material success. Zacchaeus had everything money could buy, but he still felt that something was missing. Maybe he had heard stories about Jesus, stories that spoke of hope for people who were outcasts, stories about a teacher who welcomed sinners and tax collectors. Maybe he wondered if there was a chance for someone like him to be seen differently. News about Jesus would have spread quickly in a city like Jericho. People talked, and stories traveled fast. By the time Jesus arrived, the whole city was buzzing. Zacchaeus must have known that crowds would gather, that people would be eager to see the man who healed the sick and challenged the powerful. For someone like Zacchaeus, it would have been easy to stay home and avoid the crowd. He could have hidden behind his wealth, ignored the commotion, and carried on as usual. But something stirred in him, a curiosity, maybe even a faint hope. Despite the risk of being mocked or pushed aside, Zacchaeus wanted to see Jesus for himself. He knew the crowd would not welcome him. He knew people would judge him. Still, he set aside his pride and decided to go out into the streets. It's hard to say exactly what drove him. Maybe it was the stories he had heard about Jesus' kindness to people like him. Maybe it was a longing he couldn't quite name. For a moment, think about how difficult that must have been. Zacchaeus was used to being in control, used to having power. Yet here he was, stepping into a crowd that despised him. Every step he took was a reminder of how much he was disliked. People might have whispered about him, pointed, or even tried to block his way, but Zacchaeus kept going. He was searching for something he hadn't found in all his years of collecting taxes and building wealth. This sense of searching is something many people can relate to. Even if you haven't experienced the same kind of rejection or made the same choices, you might know what it's like to feel that something is missing. Zacchaeus' story reminds us that no amount of success can fill the emptiness that comes from being cut off from others or from God. His willingness to risk embarrassment, to face the crowd, shows just how strong his desire for change had become. As Jesus entered Jericho, the excitement in the city grew. Crowds pressed in from all sides, eager for a glimpse of the teacher who had healed the blind and welcomed those others rejected. Zacchaeus could have stayed in the background, but he chose to step forward even though he knew it meant facing the scorn of his neighbors. This was not an easy choice, and it shows a different side of Zacchaeus, a side that was willing to hope even when hope seemed out of reach. The tension in Zacchaeus' heart must have been building for a long time. He was a man used to calculating risks, making deals, and keeping his distance. But in this moment, he was willing to let go of his pride. He wanted to see Jesus, even if it meant making a spectacle of himself. That decision would set the stage for what happened next, a moment that would change not only his life, but also how people would remember him. What would drive a man like Zacchaeus, with so much to lose, to take such a bold step? The answer unfolds in the next part of his story, where we see just how far he was willing to go to find what he had been missing all along. A desperate climb for hope. It's a striking image. Zacchaeus, the wealthy chief tax collector, climbing up into a tree just to catch a glimpse of Jesus. In Jericho, a man of his position was expected to hold himself with dignity, to move through life with a certain reserve. Yet here he was, setting aside every expectation and scrambling up the branches like a child who couldn't see past the crowd. It wasn't a move anyone would have predicted from someone known for power and authority. The reason for Zacchaeus' climb was simple and practical. Luke's account tells us that Zacchaeus was short, and with the crowd pressing in from all sides, he couldn't see over the heads of those gathered along the road. The sycamore fig tree he chose wasn't just any tree. It was common in Jericho and especially suited for climbing, with its broad, low branches. Zacchaeus didn't pick the tree at random. He needed a way to rise above the crowd, and the sycamore offered exactly that. This small detail shows how determined he was to see Jesus, even if it meant doing something out of the ordinary. For someone like Zacchaeus, climbing a tree was more than just a physical act. In his culture, men of wealth and status didn't run, let alone climb trees in public. It was considered undignified, something children might do but not a respected adult. Zacchaeus' willingness to risk embarrassment in front of a city that already looked down on him shows how deeply he longed for something more. He set aside his pride and social standing because his desire to see Jesus was stronger than his fear of ridicule. Imagine the scene in Jericho that day. The streets were filled with noise, people jostling for position as Jesus passed through. The crowd was thick, everyone eager for a look at the man whose reputation for miracles and compassion had spread far and wide. In the middle of that excitement, Zacchaeus' small stature became a real obstacle. He couldn't push his way to the front. The people around him likely had no intention of making room for the city's chief tax collector. If anything, they might have closed ranks even tighter, unwilling to give him the courtesy they would offer to someone they respected. So Zacchaeus made a choice. Instead of giving up, he ran ahead of the crowd and climbed up into the sycamore tree. It was a bold move, and it exposed him even more. From his perch among the branches, he was visible to everyone. People could look up and see the man who usually stayed apart, now doing something that left him open to laughter or scorn. Some in the crowd might have pointed and whispered, surprised to see someone of his stature, both literally and socially, taking such an undignified step. This moment says a lot about Zacchaeus' state of mind. Despite his wealth and authority, he was willing to risk embarrassment for a chance to see Jesus. His climb was more than a way to get a better view. It was a sign of desperation, a longing for something that money and status could not provide. The emptiness he felt was greater than his fear of what others might think. Zacchaeus' actions show us what it looks like when someone is truly searching for hope. The sycamore fig tree stands out as more than just a backdrop for this story. Its sturdy low branches made it the perfect choice for someone who needed help reaching above the crowd. But the tree also became a symbol of Zacchaeus' willingness to do whatever it took to get closer to Jesus. He didn't care how awkward he looked or how exposed he was. In that moment, his longing for a new beginning outweighed his concern for appearances. Think for a moment about what it must have felt like to be Zacchaeus up in that tree. The crowd below would have been a swirl of movement and sound. Children might have tugged at their parents, asking why the chief tax collector was sitting in a tree. Adults may have laughed or shaken their heads. Some might have looked away, uncomfortable with the sight of someone so wealthy, making himself so vulnerable. Yet Zacchaeus stayed where he was, determined not to miss the chance to see Jesus as he passed by. Why did Zacchaeus choose this moment to act so boldly? After years of living on the outside, collecting taxes for Rome, and bearing the weight of his community's resentment, something in him was stirred by the news that Jesus was coming. He had heard stories about Jesus, how he healed the sick, welcomed outsiders, and spoke with authority and compassion. Maybe Zacchaeus wondered if there was hope for someone like him. Maybe he longed for a fresh start, for a chance to be seen as more than just a tax collector. His climb up the tree wasn't just about overcoming a physical limitation. It was a way of reaching for hope, of taking a step toward something that might finally bring meaning to his life. Zacchaeus knew the crowd would not make space for him. He knew he was unwelcome, but he didn't let that stop him. Instead, he found another way, one that required humility and courage. There is something relatable about Zacchaeus' story. Many people know what it feels like to be on the outside, to long for acceptance or a sense of belonging. Zacchaeus' willingness to climb the tree despite the risk of ridicule shows us that sometimes the search for hope requires us to set aside our pride. It takes courage to admit that we need something more than what we have, and even more to act on that need in front of others. Zacchaeus' desperation to see Jesus was not a sign of weakness. In fact, it revealed the strength of his desire for change. He could have stayed hidden, protected by his wealth and position, but he chose to be seen. His climb was a public admission that he was searching for something greater than himself. It was a small act in the eyes of the crowd, but it carried deep meaning for Zacchaeus. He didn't know what would happen next. There was no guarantee that Jesus would notice him or respond in any special way. Zacchaeus was willing to take the risk anyway. His act of climbing the tree was a way of saying, "I am here, and I want to see." He put himself in a place where he could not hide, where everyone could see his longing. This moment of vulnerability set the stage for everything that would follow. Zacchaeus' willingness to risk his reputation for a chance to encounter Jesus shows us the power of hope. Sometimes, the first step toward change is simply being willing to be seen as we truly are, with all our needs and desires out in the open. As the crowd moved along the road, Zacchaeus waited in the branches, his heart pounding with anticipation. He had no idea what the next few moments would bring. All he knew was that he didn't want to miss the opportunity to see Jesus, no matter what it cost him. And as Jesus drew near, the story took a turn that no one, least of all Zacchaeus, could have expected. The unexpected call. Zacchaeus had climbed the tree hoping to stay out of sight, content to watch from a distance while the excitement of the crowd swirled below. He likely thought he could blend into the branches, just another face in the sea of people who had come to catch a glimpse of Jesus. But as Jesus reached that spot under the sycamore tree, he did something no one expected. He stopped and looked up. There, in front of everyone, Jesus called out, "Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today." The words were direct and urgent. Jesus didn't ask politely or leave the decision up in the air. He spoke with purpose and certainty, making it clear that this meeting was not by chance. He called Zacchaeus by name, even though they had never met before. In a moment, Jesus cut through the noise of the crowd and the years of isolation Zacchaeus had endured. Imagine the surprise Zacchaeus must have felt. He had only wanted to see Jesus, but now he was the center of attention. Jesus spoke to him personally, not as a tax collector or an outcast, but as a person with a name and a story. For Zacchaeus, who had spent so much of his life being ignored or avoided, this recognition must have felt overwhelming. Jesus' words held an invitation, but also a sense of urgency. He must stay at Zacchaeus' house today, not tomorrow or some other time. Zacchaeus responded right away. He hurried down from the tree and welcomed Jesus gladly. This was more than just a polite gesture. Welcoming someone into your home, in that culture, meant opening your life to them, showing trust and hospitality. Zacchaeus didn't hesitate, even though he knew what others thought of him. He was ready for something new, and Jesus' invitation gave him hope that change was possible. But not everyone felt the same way. The crowd, who had gathered in excitement to see Jesus, quickly turned their attention to what was happening. Luke tells us, "All the people saw this and began to mutter, 'He has gone to be the guest of a sinner.'" The reaction was immediate and negative. Instead of celebrating this moment, the people whispered among themselves, questioning Jesus' choice. Why would he choose someone like Zacchaeus? How could he, a respected teacher, enter the home of a man everyone else avoided? This response from the crowd reveals a lot about the world Zacchaeus lived in. Tax collectors were seen as traitors, working for the Romans and taking more than they should from their own people. They were labeled as sinners and pushed to the edges of society. For a religious leader like Jesus to associate with someone like Zacchaeus was shocking. It broke every rule and expectation the crowd held about who deserved attention and kindness. Jesus' decision to invite himself to Zacchaeus' house was not just about sharing a meal. In that time, eating together was a sign of acceptance and friendship. It showed the whole community that Jesus saw value in Zacchaeus, even when no one else did. By making this choice in front of everyone, Jesus challenged the idea that some people are beyond hope or love. He showed that God's grace reaches further than human judgment. For Zacchaeus, this invitation meant everything. He had climbed the tree out of curiosity and maybe a little desperation. Now he was being welcomed by the very person he most wanted to see. He didn't have to prove himself or make promises. Before Jesus would come into his home, the invitation came first, offered freely and without conditions. This act of grace cut through the labels and the shame that had followed Zacchaeus for years. As Zacchaeus hurried down, his heart must have raced with a mix of excitement and uncertainty. He was stepping into a new chapter, one that would be shaped by Jesus' presence in his home. He didn't know exactly what would happen next, but he was willing to open his door and his life to this unexpected guest. The crowd's reaction, though, hung in the air. Their muttering wasn't just about Zacchaeus. It was about what they believed was right and fair. They couldn't understand how Jesus could overlook Zacchaeus' past. In their minds, grace had limits, and Zacchaeus had crossed them. But Jesus didn't see things that way. His words and actions showed that no one is too far gone for God's love. This moment stood out for everyone watching. It wasn't just a private meeting, it was a public statement. Jesus was showing the crowd and Zacchaeus that worthiness isn't measured by reputation or mistakes. He was redefining what it means to be accepted by God. The invitation to Zacchaeus was an invitation to see grace in a new light, to let go of old judgments and open up to the possibility of transformation. The story invites us to think about how we view others. Are there people we see as unworthy of kindness or attention? Do we sometimes believe that grace is only for those who have done enough to deserve it? Jesus' actions challenge us to look beyond the surface, to see the person behind the labels, and to remember that everyone is invited to experience God's love. Zacchaeus' willingness to welcome Jesus shows the power of a simple act of faith. He didn't wait until his life was perfect or his reputation was restored. He responded right away, letting Jesus into his home and his heart. That openness was the first step toward real change, not just for Zacchaeus, but for everyone who witnessed this moment. The crowd, however, still struggled with what they saw. Their muttering revealed their own fears and assumptions. They held on to the idea that some people were too lost to be found, too broken to be restored. Jesus' choice to stay with Zacchaeus challenged those beliefs, offering a different way to see the world and the people in it. As Jesus and Zacchaeus walked together toward his house, the whispers and questions followed them. The crowd wondered what this visit would mean. Would Zacchaeus change? Would Jesus regret his decision? The tension in the air was real, and everyone was watching to see what would happen next. This story isn't just about a tax collector in Jericho. It's about how we respond to grace, both in our own lives and in the lives of others. It's about the courage it takes to welcome change and the humility it takes to offer acceptance. Jesus' words, "I must stay at your house today," still echo, reminding us that grace often comes when we least expect it, and that it reaches those who need it most. The invitation was clear, the response immediate, and the crowd's judgment unmistakable. But the real impact of this encounter was still unfolding. The next moments would reveal not only the depth of Zacchaeus' transformation, but also the true meaning of grace for everyone watching. What would you think if your town's most holy leader decided to publicly honor the least honorable person you know? The crowd's judgment. When Jesus called Zacchaeus down from the tree and announced he would stay at his house, the atmosphere in Jericho shifted. The crowd's reaction was immediate and clear. Luke 19 verse 7 records, "All the people saw this and began to mutter, 'He has gone to be the guest of a sinner.'" Their words hung in the air not just as a passing comment, but as a collective judgment. In their eyes, Zacchaeus was not simply a flawed neighbor. He was the very picture of what they considered wrong in their community. The term sinner was not just a label, it was a boundary marker, a way to separate the worthy from the unworthy. For tax collectors like Zacchaeus, this label was especially sharp. In Luke's Gospel, sinner often referred to those whose choices had put them outside the circle of respectability and religious approval. The crowd's murmuring was not just about Zacchaeus' past, it was about Jesus' choice to associate with him. Many in Jericho had personal reasons for their frustration. Some may have felt the sting of unfair taxes, others remembered times when Zacchaeus' decisions had caused hardship. To them, Jesus' willingness to enter his home seemed to ignore the pain Zacchaeus had caused. The people did not see this as a story of hope, they saw it as an offense. Why would a holy teacher, someone who spoke of God and righteousness, choose to share a meal with someone they saw as corrupt? Their reaction revealed something deeper than disappointment. The crowd's words pointed to a belief that God's favor should go to those who had earned it, to those who kept themselves pure and followed the rules. Zacchaeus, in their minds, did not fit the picture of someone who belonged near a holy man. They looked for outward signs, acts of generosity, a clean reputation, a record of good deeds. Zacchaeus seemed to have none of these. He was still, in their eyes, a sinner. It's easy to understand where the people of Jericho were coming from. Most of us have felt the urge to draw lines between those we think deserve kindness and those we think do not. Their response to Jesus' invitation was shaped by years of disappointment and betrayal. They saw Zacchaeus' wealth as a sign of greed, not blessing. They remembered the times he had sided with the Romans. For them, the idea that someone like Zacchaeus could receive special attention from Jesus was hard to accept. But Jesus' actions that day did not just surprise the crowd. They challenged their whole way of thinking. By choosing to be the guest of Zacchaeus, Jesus redefined what it means to be accepted by God. In that culture, sharing a meal was a public sign of relationship and honor. Jesus did not wait for Zacchaeus to prove himself first. He did not ask Zacchaeus to make amends before entering his home. Instead, he offered friendship and acceptance before any change had taken place. This was a powerful statement, not just to Zacchaeus, but to everyone watching. The crowd's judgment, then, was not just about one man. It was about their assumptions regarding grace. They believed grace was for those who had earned it, for those who measured up to the community's expectations. Jesus' choice to enter Zacchaeus' home turned that idea upside down. He showed that grace is not about merit. It is about God's willingness to meet people where they are, regardless of their past. This story invites us to reflect on our own attitudes. How often do we, like the crowd, decide who is worthy of a second chance? It's easy to look at someone's mistakes and believe they are beyond hope. We might not say it out loud, but we draw mental lines between good and bad, between us and them. The story of Zacchaeus reminds us that God's love does not fit into our categories. Jesus did not avoid the outcast. He sought him out. He did not wait for Zacchaeus to fix his life before offering acceptance. Instead, he extended grace first. For Zacchaeus, the weight of the crowd's judgment was something he had likely carried for years. Every cold glance in the marketplace, every whispered word, every moment he was excluded from community events, it all added up. Over time, those judgments can become a story we tell ourselves. Zacchaeus may have started to believe he was only what others said about him, a sinner, a cheat, someone beyond redemption. That is why Jesus' invitation was so powerful. It cut through the noise of public opinion and spoke directly to Zacchaeus' heart. As the people of Jericho watched, they faced a new challenge. Jesus was not just offering Zacchaeus a chance at a new life. He was inviting the whole community to reconsider what grace looks like. Could they see Zacchaeus as more than his past? Could they accept that God's love might reach further than their rules allowed? These were not easy questions. The crowd's muttering was a sign of how difficult it can be to let go of old judgments and open up to the possibility of change. Jesus' actions also spoke to the religious leaders and those who valued outward displays of piety. In that society, following the law and maintaining ritual purity were seen as signs of righteousness. But Jesus' willingness to eat with Zacchaeus showed that God looks at the heart, not just at outward behavior. True transformation, Jesus taught, begins on the inside. It is not about cleaning up our lives to earn God's favor. It is about responding to the invitation of grace, even when we feel unworthy. The story of Zacchaeus is a reminder that no one is beyond the reach of God's love. The crowd's judgment stands in contrast to Jesus' mercy. While people saw a sinner, Jesus saw someone ready for a new beginning. This is the heart of the gospel, that God's forgiveness is available to all, regardless of what others may say. Zacchaeus' story encourages us to believe that our past does not have to define our future. There is always hope for change. As the crowd's voices faded into the background, something significant was happening inside Zacchaeus' home. The focus shifted from public opinion to a more personal encounter. For a moment, the noise of judgment gave way to the quiet possibility of transformation. Zacchaeus was no longer just a name whispered in disapproval. He was a person about to experience the power of grace. Inside those walls, the story was far from over. The real change was just beginning, not in the crowd, but in the heart of the man who had climbed the tree. The next moments would reveal what happens when grace meets a life ready to be changed. A heart transformed. Inside Zacchaeus' home, the noise of the crowd faded away. The focus shifted to a quiet meal between Jesus and a man whose life had been shaped by choices he could no longer ignore. There was no debate or confrontation, just the honest presence of Jesus and the reality of grace filling the room. For Zacchaeus, this meal became more than just a chance to host an important guest. It became the turning point of his life. As Zacchaeus sat across from Jesus, he must have felt the weight of everything that had brought him to this moment. Jesus did not come with a list of accusations or demands. He did not remind Zacchaeus of his reputation or the mistakes that had defined him. Instead, Jesus' presence offered something that Zacchaeus had rarely experienced: acceptance without conditions. In that space, grace became real. It allowed Zacchaeus to see his life honestly, not with shame, but with the hope that change was possible. Then, in the middle of the meal, Zacchaeus stood up and made a declaration that surprised everyone. According to Luke chapter 19, verse 8, he said, "Look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor, and if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." These words were not spoken as a promise for the future. Zacchaeus spoke in the present tense, showing his immediate response to the grace he had received. He was not holding anything back. His words showed a heart already changed. Zacchaeus' commitment went far beyond what was expected. In the Old Testament, restitution for wrongdoing often meant returning what was taken, plus a portion as compensation. But Zacchaeus chose to repay 4 times what he had taken from anyone he had cheated. This was more than the law required. It was a sign that Zacchaeus understood the seriousness of his actions and wanted to make things right in a way that reflected true repentance. Giving half of his possessions to the poor was another bold step. It was a way of letting go of the wealth he had valued for so long and starting a new chapter defined by generosity. It's important to notice that Jesus did not ask Zacchaeus to do any of this. The change came from within Zacchaeus himself. His actions were not about earning Jesus' approval or trying to win back the crowd. Instead, they came from a heart that had been touched by grace. Zacchaeus' response was spontaneous and sincere. He saw clearly what needed to be done and acted on it. This is what a transformed heart looks like: not just words, but real, practical steps to make amends and help others. Imagine the silence that followed Zacchaeus' announcement. Anyone else in the room, perhaps other tax collectors or people who knew Zacchaeus well, would have been taken aback. For years, Zacchaeus had built his life around collecting wealth. Now, in one moment, he was willing to give much of it away. The transformation was visible. It was not gradual or hesitant. Zacchaeus was ready to leave his old ways behind and embrace a new way of living. Jesus' response to Zacchaeus' declaration was just as powerful. He said, "Today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham." Luke 19:9. With these words, Jesus made it clear that Zacchaeus' life had changed, not just outwardly, but at the deepest level. Salvation in this context was not only about a future hope, it was a present reality. Zacchaeus' willingness to make restitution and give generously showed that his faith was genuine. But Jesus' words also made it clear that salvation was a gift, not a reward for good behavior. Zacchaeus' actions revealed his changed heart, but it was Jesus' presence and acceptance that made the transformation possible. When Jesus called Zacchaeus a son of Abraham, he restored something that had been lost for a long time. For the Jewish people, being a son of Abraham meant belonging to God's chosen family. Zacchaeus' work as a tax collector had made him an outsider in his own community. He was seen as someone who had turned his back on his heritage and his people. But Jesus' words brought him back in. They reminded everyone in the house, and anyone who would hear the story, that Zacchaeus was not beyond hope. He was still part of God's promise. His past did not erase his place in God's family. Jesus' statement, "Today salvation has come to this house," also pointed to the wider impact of Zacchaeus' transformation. The change in Zacchaeus was not just personal. It reached his entire household. In the culture of the time, a leader's choices could shape the lives of everyone under his roof: family, servants, and even close friends. Zacchaeus' decision to turn from greed and seek restitution would have affected everyone connected to him. His house, once a symbol of wealth gained through dishonesty, now became a place where grace and renewal could be seen. This moment with Zacchaeus also showed the heart of Jesus' mission. He explained, "For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost." Luke 19:10. Zacchaeus' story was not a rare exception. It was exactly why Jesus had come, to find those who felt far from God and offer them a new beginning. Jesus did not wait for people to fix themselves before reaching out. He met them where they were, and his presence opened the door to real change. Zacchaeus' transformation prompts us to think about what true repentance and grace look like in our own lives. It is not just about feeling sorry or making promises. It is about seeing the truth of who we are, letting grace reach us, and then responding in ways that show our hearts have changed. Zacchaeus did not try to hide his past or make excuses. He faced it honestly and chose a new path. His story reminds us that grace is not just about forgiveness. It is about the possibility of living differently from this moment on. We can also see in Zacchaeus' story the importance of making things right with others. Restitution was a key part of his response. He did not only confess his wrongdoing, he took steps to restore what he had taken. This is an important aspect of repentance. It shows that we understand the impact of our actions and want to bring healing where there has been harm. Zacchaeus' commitment to repay those he had cheated was a way of honoring both God and his community. At the same time, Jesus' acceptance of Zacchaeus reminds us that no one is beyond the reach of grace. The crowd had written Zacchaeus off. They saw only his mistakes and his reputation. But Jesus saw his potential for change. He looked past the labels and called Zacchaeus by name. In doing so, he showed that God's love is bigger than our failures, and that a new beginning is possible for anyone willing to receive it. For Zacchaeus, this day marked a new identity. He was no longer defined by what he had done or what others said about him. He became someone who responded to grace with generosity and a desire to make things right. His story is an invitation for us to consider how we respond when grace comes into our lives. Do we hold on to the past, or do we let it move us toward something new? As we reflect on Zacchaeus' transformation, we are left with questions about what salvation really means. Is it only about personal change, or does it also involve reconciliation with others and restoration in our communities? Zacchaeus' experience suggests that salvation is not just about being forgiven. It is about being restored to the family of God and living out that new identity in practical ways. This story encourages us to think more deeply about what it means to be changed by grace. Zacchaeus' actions show that a transformed heart leads to a transformed life. The journey from outsider to son of Abraham was not about perfection, but about openness to the gift Jesus offered. As we move forward, we can ask ourselves how this kind of transformation might look in our own stories. Salvation redefined. Salvation, as seen in the story of Zacchaeus, is more than a private moment of forgiveness. It is an open door to belonging, restoration, and new purpose. When Jesus declared, "Today salvation has come to this house because this man too is a son of Abraham," he was doing more than simply forgiving Zacchaeus' past. He was restoring Zacchaeus' place in the family of God and the community that had pushed him aside. In a single sentence, Jesus redefined what it means to be saved. To understand the weight of Jesus' words, it helps to know what it meant to be called a son of Abraham. For Jewish people, this was not just a title. It was a sign of belonging to God's promises, a link to the covenant that began with Abraham generations before. Zacchaeus, as a chief tax collector, had become a symbol of betrayal and greed. He worked for Rome, collected more than what was owed, and became wealthy at the expense of his own people. Most saw him as someone who had turned his back on everything that mattered. But when Jesus called him a son of Abraham, he was restoring Zacchaeus' true identity. Jesus was saying, in front of everyone, that Zacchaeus was not beyond hope. He was still part of God's family. This moment was not just about Zacchaeus' personal standing with God. It was also about how the community saw him. For years, Zacchaeus had been labeled as an outsider, someone to avoid or even despise. But Jesus' words challenged everyone listening to see him differently. Jesus didn't just offer Zacchaeus forgiveness. He called those around him to recognize his place among them. The restoration was public. It was an invitation for the whole community to rethink what it means to belong. Salvation here is not only about a changed heart, it is about a changed relationship with God and with others. Zacchaeus' story shows us that when grace enters a life, it doesn't stay hidden. It spills out into actions. After meeting Jesus, Zacchaeus stood up and said, "Look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor, and if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." This was not just a promise for the future. It was a present-tense, practical response to the grace he received. Zacchaeus' repentance was real. He took steps to make things right, not just with words, but with his wealth and actions. Giving half of his possessions to the poor was a bold move. In that time, and even today, such generosity is rare. But Zacchaeus went further. He offered to repay 4 times what he had taken from anyone he had cheated. This went beyond what the law required. According to the law, double repayment was enough for most cases of theft or dishonesty. Zacchaeus' offer showed a heart eager to do more than the bare minimum. He wanted to bring healing where there had been harm. His actions were a way of rebuilding trust with those he had wronged. Jesus' response to Zacchaeus' change was simple and powerful. Today, salvation has come to this house. Notice that Jesus didn't say, salvation will come if you do these things. He said it had already come. Zacchaeus' willingness to make amends was not a condition for grace, it was the result of it. The transformation in Zacchaeus' life was evidence that grace had truly taken root. It was visible proof that salvation is more than forgiveness. It is a new way of living, one that brings hope and restoration to others. The story of Zacchaeus shows us that salvation is not just about escaping judgment or starting over privately. It is about being welcomed back into the family of God, no matter how far we have wandered. Jesus' declaration that Zacchaeus was a son of Abraham was a reminder to everyone that God's grace includes those we might overlook or exclude. Zacchaeus was not beyond reach, neither is anyone else. Jesus' closing words in this story sum up his entire mission. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. This is the heart of the gospel. Jesus did not come to reward the righteous or to confirm the crowd's judgments. He came to find those who were lost, those who knew they needed help, those who had been pushed aside, those who had lost their way. Zacchaeus was one of those people. So are many others. The crowd in Jericho struggled with what they saw. They muttered and questioned why Jesus would spend time with someone like Zacchaeus. But Jesus' actions made it clear, salvation is not about earning a place at the table. It is about responding when Jesus calls your name. Zacchaeus responded with honesty, humility, and a desire to make things right. That was enough. Jesus welcomed him and, in doing so, showed everyone that no one is too lost for grace. This story also reminds us that salvation changes more than just our relationship with God. It changes how we treat others. Zacchaeus' generosity and commitment to restitution were signs that his heart had truly changed. He wanted to restore what was broken, not just between himself and God, but between himself and his neighbors. True transformation always reaches outward. It is easy to think that some people are too far gone, that their mistakes are too great, or that their reputation can never be restored. But Zacchaeus' story shows us otherwise. When Jesus steps in, the past does not have the final word. Identity is not fixed by failure. Grace can rewrite any story. Zacchaeus, once defined by greed and betrayal, became known for generosity and restoration. That is what salvation looks like in practice. The story of Zacchaeus is not just a lesson for people long ago, it is a reminder for us today. Salvation is not a reward for good behavior or a prize for those who have always done the right thing. It is a gift, offered freely to all who are willing to respond. Zacchaeus did not earn his place at the table. He accepted the invitation, and his life was changed. When Jesus said, "Today salvation has come to this house," he was making a promise that still holds true. Anyone who responds to him with honesty and openness can experience the same welcome, the same restoration, and the same hope. It is not about perfection. It is about letting grace in and allowing it to shape how we live and how we relate to others. As we see in Zacchaeus' story, salvation is not an abstract idea. It is something that shows up in real life, in the way we treat people, in our willingness to make things right, and in the hope we carry into our relationships and communities. Zacchaeus' transformation was visible, it was practical, it was immediate. That is the kind of change Jesus brings. Jesus' mission, to seek and to save the lost, is not just a summary of one story, it is the foundation of his entire ministry. He looks for those who are searching, those who feel left out, those who wonder if they can ever belong again. Zacchaeus' story tells us that the answer is always yes. As we reflect on this story, we see that grace meets us where we are, but it never leaves us there. Zacchaeus climbed a tree hoping only to see Jesus, but he found so much more: acceptance, restoration, and a new way of living. The invitation is still open to anyone willing to respond. What would it take for you to step out of your comfort zone and seek Jesus, even if it means facing uncertainty or risk? Lessons from Zacchaeus' boldness. Zacchaeus' story gives us more than just a memorable scene of a man climbing a tree. It offers clear lessons about what it means to seek Jesus, how Jesus responds, and what real change looks like. Let's take a closer look at 3 key takeaways from Zacchaeus' boldness, each rooted in what we see in Luke 19. The first lesson is about Zacchaeus' bold pursuit. Zacchaeus did not wait for the crowd to thin out or for someone to give him permission. He saw an opportunity and acted, even though it meant risking embarrassment and stepping outside what was expected of someone in his position. At that time, a chief tax collector was a person of status and authority in Jericho. It would have been easy for Zacchaeus to stay hidden in the back, protected by his wealth and position. Instead, he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore tree, making himself visible to everyone. This act wasn't just about getting a better view, it was a sign of how much he wanted to see Jesus for himself. This kind of boldness is not just about being brave in public, it's about having a sense of urgency and a willingness to do whatever it takes to encounter Jesus. Zacchaeus probably knew the crowd would not welcome him. He likely expected to hear whispers and see people point and laugh. Yet his desire to meet Jesus was stronger than his fear of what others might think. He set aside his pride and social standing for a chance at something greater. This shows us that seeking Jesus often means moving past our comfort zones. It means being willing to take the first step, even if it feels awkward or risky. Zacchaeus' climb up the tree is a good reminder that faith sometimes requires action. We may not have to climb a tree, but there are moments when we need to take a step toward Jesus, even if it means standing out or facing questions. There will always be reasons to stay where we are: fear of judgment, habits that keep us distant, or the comfort of routine. Zacchaeus teaches us that the reward of meeting Jesus is worth the risk. When we make the choice to pursue him, even in small ways, we open ourselves up to real change. The second lesson comes from how Jesus responds to Zacchaeus' boldness. When Jesus reached the spot where Zacchaeus was perched, he stopped, looked up, and called him by name. "Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today." With these words, Jesus made it clear that he saw Zacchaeus, not just as a tax collector or an outcast, but as a person worth knowing. Jesus' invitation was personal and urgent. He didn't wait for Zacchaeus to prove himself or fix his life first. He offered acceptance before Zacchaeus had a chance to say or do anything. This moment in the story highlights Jesus' inclusive grace. The crowd saw Zacchaeus as a sinner, someone who didn't deserve attention or kindness. But Jesus looked past the labels and reached out to him anyway. He invited himself into Zacchaeus' home, showing everyone that God's love is not limited by reputation or the opinions of others. Jesus' willingness to stay with Zacchaeus was a public statement that no one is too far gone for grace. He didn't just tolerate Zacchaeus, he sought him out and made him feel seen. This is a powerful reminder for us. Sometimes we think we need to get everything in order before we can come to Jesus. We worry that our mistakes or our past will keep us at a distance. But the story of Zacchaeus shows us that Jesus meets us where we are. He calls us by name, offering acceptance before we have a chance to earn it. His grace is for everyone, even those who feel most unworthy. The third lesson is about how Zacchaeus responds once he meets Jesus. As they share a meal in Zacchaeus' home, something shifts inside him. He stands up and says, "Look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor, and if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." This is not just a promise for the future, it's an immediate, practical response to the grace he has received. Zacchaeus doesn't just say he's sorry, he takes steps to make things right. This call to respond in tangible repentance is a key part of Zacchaeus' story. His actions go far beyond what was required by law. In the Old Testament, making restitution usually meant returning what was taken, plus a portion as compensation. Zacchaeus chooses to repay 4 times what he took and to give away half of his wealth. This shows that true repentance is not just about words or feelings. It involves real, concrete steps to restore what has been broken and to help others. Zacchaeus' generosity and willingness to make amends are signs of a transformed heart. Meeting Jesus didn't just change how he felt, it changed how he lived. His priorities shifted from holding on to wealth and power to making things right and caring for those in need. This is what happens when grace takes root in someone's life. The change is visible. It affects not just our relationship with God, but also our relationships with others. These 3 lessons, bold pursuit, inclusive grace, and tangible repentance, are all woven together in Zacchaeus' story. Each one builds on the other. Zacchaeus' willingness to seek Jesus set the stage for an encounter with grace. Jesus' acceptance made room for transformation, and Zacchaeus' response showed what real change looks like in practice. It's worth noting that none of this happened in isolation. The crowd watched as these events unfolded. They saw Zacchaeus climb the tree, heard Jesus call him by name, and witnessed his decision to make restitution. The story challenged their assumptions about who was worthy of God's attention. It invited them, and it invites us, to reconsider what grace looks like and how we respond when someone chooses a new path. Sometimes we find ourselves in the crowd, unsure how to react when grace reaches someone we least expect. Other times we are in Zacchaeus' place, feeling the weight of our own choices and wondering if it's too late for us. Zacchaeus' story reminds us that it is never too late to seek Jesus, never too late to respond to grace, and never too late to make things right. The boldness of Zacchaeus was not just about climbing a tree. It was about a willingness to be seen, to risk judgment, and to hope for something better. Jesus' response was not just about sharing a meal, it was about redefining who belongs in God's family. And Zacchaeus' change was not just about feeling different, it was about living differently in ways that brought healing and restoration. As we think about these lessons, it's helpful to ask ourselves where we see ourselves in this story. Are we willing to take a bold step, even if it means facing discomfort or criticism? Do we believe that Jesus' grace is big enough for everyone, including those we might overlook? Are we ready to let grace change not just our hearts, but our actions toward others? Zacchaeus' story is a reminder that the journey of faith is active. It asks us to move, to respond, and to let our encounters with Jesus shape the way we live. The rewards of seeking Jesus, acceptance, transformation, and a new way of life are always greater than the risks. As we move forward, let's keep in mind the power of bold faith, the reach of Jesus' grace, and the importance of responding with real change. Zacchaeus' story is not just about what happened in Jericho long ago. It's a picture of what is possible for anyone willing to take that first step. And if Zacchaeus could be welcomed and transformed, what does that mean for the rest of us? No one is too far gone. Sometimes it's easy to wonder if there really is such a thing as being too far gone. Zacchaeus' story answers that question with a clear and hopeful message. No one is beyond God's reach. Even someone like Zacchaeus, a man whose choices had cut him off from his neighbors and whose reputation was built on dishonesty, was not excluded from the possibility of change. The story in Luke 19 shows us that God's grace is not measured by our past, our failures, or what others say about us. Instead, it is measured by Jesus' willingness to seek out and save those who are lost, just as he said, "For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost." Zacchaeus' life in Jericho was marked by isolation. He was a chief tax collector, known for working with the Romans and taking more than his share. People in his community saw him as a traitor and a cheat. They didn't just avoid him. They judged him as someone who had chosen wealth over loyalty, comfort over integrity. In their eyes, Zacchaeus had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. When they looked at him, they saw someone who was too far gone for forgiveness or hope. But the way Jesus treated Zacchaeus was different from anything the crowd expected. Jesus didn't ignore him or walk past with a shrug. Instead, he stopped, looked up into the tree where Zacchaeus sat, and called him by name. This simple act was more than a greeting. It was an invitation. Jesus didn't ask Zacchaeus to explain himself or to prove he deserved a second chance. He didn't wait for Zacchaeus to make things right before reaching out. Jesus' words, "I must stay at your house today," showed that God's love comes first. It reaches into our lives before we've had a chance to fix anything. This moment in the story is important. Zacchaeus didn't expect to be noticed, let alone welcomed. He had climbed the tree just to see Jesus from a distance, not to become the center of attention. Yet Jesus drew near and made space for Zacchaeus to respond. The crowd murmured and questioned Jesus' choice, saying, "He has gone to be the guest of a sinner." But Jesus wasn't interested in their approval. He saw Zacchaeus as someone who mattered, someone worth reaching out to no matter what the crowd thought. Zacchaeus' transformation didn't start with a grand plan or a list of good deeds. It began with being seen and accepted. When grace met Zacchaeus right where he was, it sparked something new in him. He stood up and said, "Look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor, and if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." This wasn't just a show for the crowd. It was the response of a heart changed by the experience of being welcomed and forgiven. Zacchaeus' actions were bold and costly, but they were also joyful. He wasn't trying to earn grace. He was living out the new life that grace had made possible. What stands out in this story is how Jesus' acceptance changes everything. Zacchaeus didn't have to clean up his life before Jesus would come to his house. He didn't have to prove he was worthy. Jesus' invitation came first, and Zacchaeus' response followed. This is the pattern of grace. It finds us where we are, and it invites us to something better. The story doesn't gloss over Zacchaeus' past or pretend he hadn't made mistakes. Instead, it shows that even the most broken stories can be rewritten. For many people, the hardest part of believing in grace is accepting that it could really be for them. Maybe you feel like your mistakes are too big or too many. Maybe you carry shame that keeps you at a distance, convinced that you're defined by what you've done or by what others say about you. Zacchaeus' story reminds us that Jesus sees beyond all that. He doesn't look at you through the lens of your worst moments. He calls you by name and invites you to come close. The crowd's reaction to Jesus' kindness toward Zacchaeus is also worth noticing. They couldn't understand why Jesus would choose to spend time with someone they had written off. Their muttering reveals a common belief, that some people are simply outside the reach of grace. But Jesus' actions challenge that idea. He makes it clear that no one is beyond hope. The very people others think are lost causes are often the ones Jesus seeks out first. The story of Zacchaeus is not just about personal forgiveness, it's about restoration. Restoration to community, to purpose, and to a new way of living. When Zacchaeus responded to Jesus, he didn't just say he was sorry. He made things right with those he had wronged. He gave to the poor and repaid those he had cheated. His transformation was visible not just in his words, but in his actions. This is what happens when grace takes root in a person's life. It moves us to repair what we can and to live differently going forward. Jesus' words at the end of the story, "Today salvation has come to this house," are a promise that change is possible for anyone. Salvation is not just about a future hope, it's about a present reality. For Zacchaeus, it meant a new identity, a new community, and a new way of seeing himself. For us, it means that our past does not have to be the final word. No matter how far we feel we've wandered, Jesus offers a way back. If you've ever wondered whether your story is too complicated or your mistakes too great, let Zacchaeus' story encourage you. God's grace is bigger than anything that stands in the way. Jesus' mission, as he said himself, is to seek and to save the lost. That includes everyone, those who feel invisible, those who have failed, those who have been written off by others, and those who have written themselves off. There is no one too far gone. This message is not just for the distant past, it's for today. It's for anyone who feels stuck, isolated, or weighed down by regret. Zacchaeus' willingness to climb a tree, to risk embarrassment just for a glimpse of Jesus, shows that even small steps toward faith can open the door to transformation. Jesus meets us in those moments, ready to offer acceptance and a new beginning. Grace doesn't erase the past, but it does offer a new future. It invites us to take responsibility, to make amends where we can, and to live with hope. Zacchaeus' story is a reminder that change is possible, not because we are strong enough, but because God's love is strong enough to reach us no matter where we are. Let's take a moment to reflect on what this means for each of us. If you've ever doubted that God's grace could reach you, remember Zacchaeus. If you've ever thought someone else was too far gone, remember how Jesus went straight to the one everyone else avoided. The story encourages us to look for grace, to expect it, and to extend it to others. So, as we consider Zacchaeus' journey, let's think about the steps we might take in our own lives. The story is not just about a man in Jericho long ago. It's about the ongoing invitation Jesus offers to each of us. No one is too far gone. The door is always open to begin again. With that in mind, let's pause and consider what one man's climb can teach us about our own faith. Zacchaeus' story to our lives means looking honestly at the choices we make, the risks we're willing to take, and the way we respond to the grace that meets us. The story is not just about an ancient figure in Jericho, it's about the decisions we face each day, whether to stay where we are or to step out in faith even when it feels uncomfortable or uncertain. One clear application is the courage to step out in faith, just as Zacchaeus did. He didn't let his past or the crowd's opinion keep him from seeking Jesus. When he realized Jesus was coming through his town, Zacchaeus didn't wait for a better moment or for someone to invite him. He acted right away, even if it meant climbing a tree and risking embarrassment. This kind of boldness is something we can practice in our own lives. There are times when following Jesus means moving beyond what feels safe or familiar. It might mean starting a conversation about faith when you're not sure how it will be received, or reaching out to someone you've avoided. It could be as simple as making time for prayer or reading scripture, or as challenging as asking for forgiveness or offering it to someone else. Seeking Jesus with urgency doesn't always mean a dramatic gesture. Sometimes it's the quiet decision to show up, to pray, or to ask honest questions about faith. Other times, it's taking a public step, joining a community, volunteering, or sharing your story. The important thing is the willingness to move toward Jesus, even when you don't know what the outcome will be. Zacchaeus didn't know what would happen when he climbed that tree, but he knew he didn't want to miss the chance to see Jesus. In the same way, we are invited to take steps, big or small, that open us to encounter God's presence in our lives. Another important lesson from Zacchaeus is the call to share grace with others. The crowd in Jericho judged Zacchaeus based on his past. They saw him as someone unworthy of attention, let alone favor from a respected teacher. But Jesus saw Zacchaeus differently. He saw a person who could be changed, someone who mattered. This perspective challenges us to examine our own attitudes toward others. Are there people we overlook, write off, or judge because of their mistakes or reputation? Zacchaeus' story asks us to see people as Jesus does, not for what they have done, but for who they can become. Sharing grace means making room for others. even when it feels difficult. It might mean listening without judgment, offering a second chance, or simply being present for someone who feels alone. Grace doesn't excuse harmful actions, but it opens the door to change. When we treat others with the same kindness and acceptance Jesus showed Zacchaeus, we help create an environment where transformation is possible. Sometimes it's our willingness to offer grace that gives someone else the courage to take their own step of faith. Zacchaeus also shows us that responding to grace involves more than just feeling sorry for the past. His encounter with Jesus led to real, practical change. He decided to give half of his possessions to the poor and to repay anyone he had cheated 4 times over. This wasn't about earning approval, but about living out the new life he had received. For us, repentance can look like making amends, seeking reconciliation, or changing habits that keep us from living honestly. It might mean apologizing to someone we've hurt, returning something that isn't ours, or letting go of resentment. These actions can be difficult, but they are a way of showing that grace has taken root in our lives. Sometimes the hardest part is believing that change is possible. Zacchaeus' story reminds us that no one is stuck in their past. The labels others give us, or the ones we give ourselves, are not the final word. Jesus' invitation to Zacchaeus was not based on his record or reputation. It was an act of love that made a new beginning possible. If you feel weighed down by mistakes or by what others think of you, remember that Jesus calls you by name, just as he called Zacchaeus. The invitation is to come as you are, trusting that grace will meet you and lead you forward. If you're wondering where to start, consider what it would look like to seek Jesus with the same urgency Zacchaeus showed. Is there an area in your life where you need to take a step, however small, toward faith? Maybe it's reaching out for help, asking a question you've held back, or making space in your routine for prayer. Or perhaps it's deciding to forgive someone or to ask for forgiveness yourself. Each of these steps is a way of moving toward Jesus, opening yourself to the possibility of transformation. It's also worth reflecting on how you view others. Are there people in your life you find hard to accept or forgive? Are there situations where you've been quick to judge or slow to offer grace? Zacchaeus' story challenges us to look again, to see the potential for change in everyone, and to be part of creating a community where grace is real and visible. For some, the application of Zacchaeus' story may be very personal, a reminder that you are not beyond hope, no matter what your past holds. For others, it may be a call to extend grace outward to help others see that they too can be welcomed and restored. In both cases, the story points us back to Jesus' mission, to seek and to save the lost. There is also a practical dimension to this story. Zacchaeus made restitution as part of his transformation. If there are ways you can make things right, with God, with yourself, or with others, consider what steps you can take. Sometimes that means having a difficult conversation, returning something that was taken, or making a commitment to change a harmful pattern. These acts are not about earning grace, but about living honestly in response to it. As you reflect on Zacchaeus' story, remember that transformation is not a one-time event. It's an ongoing process of seeking, responding, and growing. Some days it might feel like you're just climbing a tree, trying to catch a glimpse of hope. Other days you may find yourself welcoming grace into your home, surprised by how much can change in a single encounter. Both are part of the journey. The message of Zacchaeus is not just for those who feel lost. It's for anyone who wants to experience the freedom and hope that come from meeting Jesus. Whether you are just beginning to ask questions about faith or you've followed Jesus for years, the invitation is the same. Take a step, open your heart, and be willing to be changed. As we consider how Zacchaeus' story applies to our lives, let's be honest about where we stand. Are we willing to risk discomfort to seek Jesus? Are we open to offering grace to others even when it's hard? Are we ready to let go of old patterns and take practical steps toward healing and reconciliation? Each of these questions can guide us as we move forward. There are no perfect answers, and the journey will look different for everyone. But the story of Zacchaeus gives us a place to start. It offers a picture of what is possible when we respond to Jesus with honesty and courage. It shows us that grace is not just an idea, but a way of living that changes us and those around us. Let's take these lessons to heart as we think about what it means to live with faith and hope. The story of Zacchaeus is a reminder that transformation is always possible, and that God's love reaches further than we can imagine. Each step we take, no matter how small, matters. As we move forward, let's keep in mind the power of seeking Jesus boldly and extending grace to others. These are not just ancient truths, but practical ways to live out our faith each day. And as we reflect on Zacchaeus' journey, we're invited to consider what it means for our own stories, especially when we feel far from where we want to be. With these thoughts in mind, let's look at what Zacchaeus' story ultimately reveals about the reach of God's love. Conclusion. As we reach the end of Zacchaeus' story, we see a powerful reminder that God's love and grace are for everyone, no matter where they've been or what others may think. Jesus' words, "For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost," show us that transformation doesn't depend on having a perfect past. It begins with being open to encounter and change. Take a moment to reflect. What is one step you can take today to seek Jesus, even if it feels small or uncertain? Like Zacchaeus, your willingness to reach out could open the way for a new chapter. What will your next step be? If this touched your heart, share it with someone who needs it. And if you haven't already, like and subscribe. That's how we keep bringing hope and faith, one story at a time.